Okay, so we've discussed religion and ethics, and we're making our way to the modern period in history. This week we'll be discussing David Hume in class. Next week we'll be taking on Immanuel Kant. So how did we get to these two thinkers? And so we're going to transition, kind of historically transition away from kind of a religious conception of the world to the scientific conception. So this is the paradigm shift. So just here are some parts of that shift. You'll be familiar with the geocentric view of the universe. This was put forth by Aristotle. And of course, the church, and that's capital C church, supported Aristotelian, or this Aristotelian conception of the universe. This comes to the church via Aquinas, etc. So here's a couple of verses that support the idea that the Earth is not only the center of the universe, but is stable, not moving. So these are, or this is an image of what the planets would have to do in order for the Earth to be the center of the universe and not moving. So most interestingly, what Jupiter has to do. All right, and so eventually, and why is it a paradigm shift? Well, eventually the mathematics, the formulas became so complicated that they had to, that there must be a way to simplify the universe. And so we get the heliocentric view or version of the universe, most famously put forth by Copernicus, further supported by Galileo. And then you can see in this list kind of the transition, moving away from that religious view of astronomy. So eventually, when we get to Laplace, in the early 19th century, when asked about his famous book on astronomy, right, asked where was God? Why didn't you include God in your book? Laplace says, I had no use for that hypothesis. So this is, on the right, this is an image of the Copernican universe. The sun is the center, heliocentric. Right? All right, so a little even more background here, so you understand how important this paradigm shift is. If we think about how humans have conceived of the universe, that fundamentally humans are trying to answer two primal questions, right? Number one, what is the universe and what is my place in it? And number two, how do I get some control of my destiny, control of my environment, etc. You can think about early man, 10,000 BC, facing the same sort of environmental influences that we are today, but having a different method for dealing with those difficulties. So the history of consciousness, this is a way of conceptualizing how man has attempted to answer those two questions, right? So we can think about man's sort of evolution in thinking, or how man has attempted to grapple with the difficulties that come from the environment. So the first stage, this would be man in his initial state, right? The mythopoeic phase. And you can think about ancient man, attempting to deal with things, floods, drought, etc. And so this phase is marked by animism, basically giving human-like qualities to inanimate things, spiritualizing inanimate things. And then second, we have the religious phase, and the religion phase is basically a systematization of the mythopoeic phase. That is, you have, in the mythopoeic stage, you have lots of individuated tribes. Now, they all have their own versions of the divine realms, right? Spirits for lots of different things. And so, as these versions of the divine compete, eventually they come together and they form larger groups, and they begin to agree on a certain set of say, deities or truths about that unseen world. And also keep in mind that in both of these, the spiritual world is very human-like. So you see early man attempting to satisfy the gods by doing things that a human would like, right? That if there's not enough rain, well, you've obviously upset the god of the rain, so you need to do something to satisfy him, right? And there are many, some awful ways of doing that. And then number 3, the shift to philosophy, and we talked about this earlier in the semester when we talked about those pre-Socratic philosophers. And these thinkers used reason alone to come to understand the universe, to make sense of the world, right? That it was a turning away from religious thinking, right? When if you think about where knowledge comes from, in religion, it doesn't come from reason or logic, right? It is divine revelation, that the truth about the world is simply revealed, right? Whereas with philosophy, it is your own intellect that can guide you to the truths of the world. And then the paradigm shift that we're talking about is the shift to science. And this would be the phase in the history of consciousness that we're in now, for sure, right? That science uses reason, the reason of philosophy, but adds observation and experimentation so that what is true about the world can be discovered through man's intellect, but you must be able to use repeatable experiments to further justify that knowledge. Right, so this would be empirical truth that can be observed. Now, the reason these are called phases is that we haven't necessarily, that once we've passed from one to another, the preceding phase has not disappeared. Right, it's not gone away. I mean, there is still religious thinking. Right, and even though we're in the scientific realm, here you are in a philosophy class, right? So don't think of these as the successive phases trumping the others. That the others still exist. Okay, so this is the shift that we're talking about. This is the shift from teleology to mechanism. Now, teleology, keep in mind, deals with purposes, right? This is the Aristotelian concept taken up by Aquinas, the idea that there is a purpose to everything, right? Whereas when we move to mechanism, when we move to science, science is purely functional, can only deal with how things work. It doesn't deal with those why questions. So here's some examples of what changes as we shift from kind of the religious thinking to scientific thinking. So first, the questions become different, right? Whereas religion would say, why do we have disease? What is the purpose of disease? Science can only tell us how disease works, how it functions. It doesn't deal with purposes, the purpose of disease. Number 2, our conception of truth changes. Right, for the religious world, the truth is those things that are not tangible. So if you think about the religious conception of the individual, is the capital T truth of the individual the physical, the body? Absolutely not. Right, the capital T truth of the individual is the soul. Right, that unseen part. And then number 3, the conception of the world shifts. Right, so the religious view of the world is that there is a divine plan and that people are simply playing out his or her particular part, or in that drama unfolding. Right, and then for science, the world is simply matter in motion, and that's a quote from Thomas Hobbes, right? That scientific thinking is only functional, right? It's a material world. Okay, so during this paradigm shift, we see the church losing dominance. Right? And so there are external and internal causes to the church losing its power. Right? And notice here again, it's capital C church. So the external causes, we talked about Copernicus and his heliocentric model. Next is Galileo, and if you'll recall, he upheld the Copernican model of the universe and was brought before the Inquisition, and at that time he recanted. He said, I really didn't mean it, because we all know what the consequences were for not doing what the Inquisition wished you to do. And then internal causes, the church was losing power because of corruption, that the church was selling indulgences. And indulgences were basically, the church was accepting payment to absolve those sinners who were already dead. So you might say, my uncle died and he didn't have time to repent, or he wasn't Catholic. How much should I write the check for to, get him out of hell? And, they'd come up with a dollar amount. And then, of course, of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, translated the Bible into German, etc. Okay, so when we think about the modern world, when we think about what it means to be modern, these are going to be kind of four basic foundations for the modern world. Number one, there has to be a separation between church and state. That with the splintering of the Catholic Church due to the Protestant Reformation, or the splintering of the capital C Church, and you can think of all the say Christian denominations you can think of, right? Well, if we're going to have a religiously based government, which one would you choose? And of course, you wouldn't be able to choose just one. So there has to be a separation there. Number two, the importance of the individual is one of the important facets of the modern world. That if you think about the religious tenets of Protestantism, right? That does Protestantism tell you that you should, go talk to your priest or your bishop in order to get absolution? No, for Protestants, it's a direct relationship with the divine. So, in order for you to gain salvation, etc., it's up to you, the individual. So we see the importance of the individual take on a great part of the modern world. And then thirdly, science becomes common ground. And again, with the church being wrong about astronomy, most importantly, we see people more and more relying on science and not the religious perspective. And then, of course, because of the splintering of the church, we see the rise in relativism, that if there is no capital C church, capital T truth, we have to admit that the Methodists and the Baptists are both correct, then truth is relative, right? So you see this growth of relativism. All right, and so at this time, right, leading up to the 18th century, but really the 17th century, we see this battle happening between the church and science. And so the first thinker on the scene to try to resolve this conflict is Rene Descartes. And Rene Descartes set out to solve this dispute, to find a way that religion and science could coexist. Right? So what he set out to do was find the apodictic foundation for truth. That is the absolute fundamental foundation for truth. And so he goes about this by using what we call radical doubt. That is, if he can doubt something, even a little bit, he throws it out. Again, he's looking for that foundation for truth that is indubitable. You cannot doubt it. Right? And so, briefly, he starts with the senses individually. He says, okay, I can rely on my senses individually. Right? And then he says, okay, can I doubt that my senses have told me the truth? Well, and you can say, well, I've seen put the stick in the water, the straw in the water glass, and it looks bent. You can say, okay, well, my eyes have failed me. Or I hear my name and no one's there, right? Okay, my hearing has failed me. So he says, well, you can't trust your senses individually. And he goes on and on until he finds what he takes to be the apodictic foundation for truth, that absolute fundamental foundation for truth. And that is famously cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And this is going to be the jumping off point for David Hume.